Hey, what's up? I'm Sylvia.
And I'm Brad.
And today I'm going to be building my very first ITX PC live on camera for all of you. No pressure, but with some help. So do you have any advice for me, Brad?
Yeah, it's not too hard. Just follow the instructions.
Oh. Ooh, color-coded. Yeah, you know what? This looks pretty straightforward. I don't need you. Get out. Leave. I am so excited to introduce you to the Revolt 3 ITX case today. This brand is a sister brand to iBuyPower, and the Revolt 3 is a continuation on the Revolt series that was originally introduced to iBuyPower.
The first Revolt system launched in 2013. That was the Revolt 1. It was a big like esports and tournament basis, some small form factor ITX. If anyone went to an MLG tournament back in 2014 or 2015, you probably saw one of those. And then in 2015, we had the Revolt 2. We really wanted to present the graphics card, so there's like this clear window on the top of the case, and one of the features that was requested from some of the tournament organizers was they wanted to be able to access the storage more easily, because in between games they would swap drives out. So we actually put the SSDs right up in the front of the system where they could get to them really quick. We kind of went looking for what would the successor to those two cases be.
And so this was the result, the Revolt 3.
Yes.
Now Revolt 3 is launching under HYTE, and HYTE is a DIY-centric brand. The core ethos of HYTE is that play should be experienced even before you power your PC on. Building a PC should be fun. So Brad, what makes this ITX case different from what else is on the market right now?
Traditionally, ITX cases are very limiting. You'll find yourself running into all these compatibility limitations as you try to spec out your PC. Our main goal when designing the Revolt 3 was as wide of compatibility as possible, while still keeping, you know, a reasonably small footprint. There's very few limitations on all of the different bits of hardware, you know, other than the fact that you are limited to an ITX motherboard. And then one of the little kind of personal things was none of those cases had a handle, and so we made sure to include a handle.
I know ITX can be a particularly intimidating build to do, especially for first timers. So you're learning right alongside me. I'm gonna be making mistakes so you don't have to. And Brad's going to be pointing out some tips and tricks for your own builds once you decide, obviously, that this is the case for you. So let's get started. We're going to start with the motherboard. That's typically the place to start when you're building a PC. One thing you're going to find out is that the order in which you assemble your PC will be extremely important for ITX, just because we're dealing with a limited amount of real estate here. The first thing I wanted to show you, though, was how easy it is to get inside this PC. We designed the Revolt 3 to be easily removed. So we have ball and socket adapters that are on each of these panels, as well as magnetic mesh that slides right in and out. You've got a magnet at the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and take all these off. Why don't you tell me a little bit about what makes ITX motherboards both a challenge and also kind of different from your typical ATX board?
Yeah, so ITX boards, right, they're much smaller. They're designed to be used in these small form factor systems, about a third the size of a regular motherboard. But they're trying to cram all those same features down into, you know, this tiny little footprint. So they're very dense, right? You can see there's a lot of stuff going on this board. There's not a lot of wasted real estate here, but there are limitations in terms of connectivity. They'll only have one slot for your graphics cards, only one PCI Express 16 slot. They usually only have 2 slots for memory, whereas a typical full-size board would have 4 or 8. And then other things like SATA ports and M.2 slots and USB connectors, right? There's just only so much space for them to fit all this stuff. But most ITX boards still have more than enough connectivity for the average user. Like I said, 1 graphics card, 4 hard drives, 2 sticks of memory, M.2 SSD, like, you know, you can't really ask for too much more than that.
Now this top panel is also removable. What are some of the use cases you would have to take this off?
Yeah, so unlike the 4 side panels, the top panel is held on with screws. There's just 4 screws around the sides.
It's got the handle, so it makes sense.
Yeah,
you don't want that to be ball and socket.
If you need to clean the dust filter up top, you would take that off. Or if you have an especially large graphics card, we did build in a little bit of space up in the kind of ceiling of the case, an extra 10 or 15 millimeters for cards that are taller than the little pocket that we have up here in the front.
You've got your CPU. Best practice for CPU, again, make sure you're grounded and that you're working in a static-free area. There's usually an indicator on your CPU that will hint to you what your orientation should be. For example, in this one, we've got a couple of notches here. So we want to make sure that it's lined up correctly and gently drop that in. Then you close the foot down, use the tension, make sure it's locked in place, and voila, CPU installed. Easy as that. My next thing was gonna be RAM, but you off camera were like, oh, that might not be the best next step. Why is that?
So for this particular motherboard, you'll notice that the 24 pin is right next to the memory. When you're in ITX boards, like I said, everything's kind of crammed together. And when you're plugging this 24 pin in, it is sometimes nice to be able to grip both sides, and it's just that one of whichever side of your finger is going to be in where this RAM slot is. So once you've installed the board, you can get at it from basically any side. If your 24 pin on whatever board you happen to be using is in a different place, you can load the memory in now. But I would put the M.2 SSD in.
You've got the connector here that will go into this socket here. And make sure that your little notch that you'll see here lines up with the little notch in here before inserting and installing. Once you get this in,
you'll want to take the screw out first.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, I preloaded
you know what?
the screw.
I am notorious for being a little too gentle with these things.
Yeah, you can.
There it goes.
You go.
You should hear it click. You should always hear it click. So if you're doing this for the first time and you're a little bit hesitant like me, just make sure that you hear it click and that things are lined up.
And you'll also know because when you push the SSD down, the end will line up with the hole. If it's not.
It's not all the way in there.
Yeah, then it won't line up. I would recommend installing or at least mounting the water block. So normally an AIO would come with thermal paste pre-applied, but like I said, we've used some of these parts before, so we've cleaned them up.
If you look at your motherboard, you'll see 4 holes on these corners around your CPU. This goes onto the back of the board, and then we install standoffs like this.
This was the part that I was saying that's kind of interesting, right? Because we have all this length of tubing, and that's how big the case is. When it actually gets installed into the case, this water block is going to be kind of like this.
So to summarize, make sure that you know where your motherboard is going to be oriented in this case, and try to predetermine how this is going to coil for you before installing.
Previously had mentioned if you were going to be installing an air cooler, you would want fans out over the CPU for more surface area. It's going to get in the way of those when you're trying to plug them in. So, but because this is a liquid cooler, the actual pump is pretty small. You can mount it beforehand.
Now, one other little tip as you're assembling, it's best to install screws in an X pattern because again, that's going to help spread tension out evenly over your hardware. Be very mindful when you're tightening not to over tighten and to install in that X pattern, and you should avoid some of those more common pitfalls that people run into. And you can see we already have our power supply installed on HYTE.com. When you go to the Revolt page, you will have the option to purchase with or without an included power supply. We right now have a fully modular PSU that comes with the Revolt 3. I believe it's a 700 watt.
700 watts.
700 watt. Now you can really only use the SFX form factor for PSUs, right?
SFX and SFXL will fit.
Okay.
So this is an SFXL power supply. We size it around like any single graphics card, and a pretty high-end CPU as well. So we pre-install the power supply. Some of the cables are slightly pre-routed to kind of like where they would end up in your build anyways. Okay. So the next thing that we'll do is start opening up the case, right? So here's our screwdriver. I would take off this panel first.
Okay.
So this is kind of like a little guard for the graphics card power cables. When the card is installed in the system, those graphics card power cables are going to run this way. That just kind of keeps them from poking out into the side panel.
Okay.
So go ahead and remove those 2 screws, set that thing aside. We're not going to put it back until like the very end. And there's the radiator door. So there's 4 screws, 2 at the top, 2 at the bottom. We take all those out and it's going to open up on a hinge. As long as it's cable managed properly, everything just kind of swings open like that.
Okay,
and
so you can get right at the board and make upgrades.
Yeah, like I said, if you need to change out a stick of RAM, you just undo those, you pop the side panel off, undo those 4 screws, open that, deal with the RAM, and then close it back up again. You didn't have to unplug anything, you only had to undo a few screws.
And then the motherboard sits in here?
Yep.
Okay, remind me how we're orienting this.
These ports are going to face that way. So basically,
towards the bottom here?
Yeah, so grab the board with the radiator.
I want to carry all the heavy parts, not lift it by the...
And then you're going to want to kind of angle it down so this side in first and then down.
Got it.
The back.
So like this?
Yeah. And there should be
like
enough space for it to kind of overshoot the screw holes, and then if you have like Wi-Fi antenna screws in the back, and then it'll kind of shift.
I see.
What I would do now, and if you were to install an air cooler, you'd also be doing this step, is to run the smaller headers to where they need to go.
Okay.
So you should find a bundle up under the case of the USB 3, the front panel switch, and the front panel audio.
Okay.
And that'll come up through this hole and then plug into their respective spots on the board.
Okay.
it
So
should
the
be-
bundle is right, oh, it's right here,
should be
underneath the
under
bottom
there
here.
somewhere, yeah,
Here,
yeah.
this is blocking, so I'm just gonna,
Okay.
would you mind, well, we'll just
Yeah,
like
I
flop
said,
it that
you can just
direction.
kind of lay this down. It'll.
Again, I am notorious for being too gentle with my hardware, but I'd rather be too gentle than too rough, you know? So this bundle is coming out the bottom right here, if you can see.
So there's the two USB 3A ports, there's the power button and the audio jack. This case does also have USB-C. For compatibility reasons, we chose to have that be a pass-through. Kind of the thinking was that anything you have plugged in permanently, you would have plugged into the bottom I/O, and then kind of tie that, cable manage that up, and keep it neat. And then if you
Yeah.
had things that you were temporarily plugging and unplugging, we included a lot of front I/O, right? So there's 3 total USB ports, which is, statistically it's a lot for an ITX case. A lot
Sure.
of them might only come with 1. Now that you've gotten your front panel headers through, you're gonna start kind of hunting for like where those things plug in and start plugging them in, and then kind of visualize what the best way to kind of route that cable around.
Okay.
Because the only thing you really have to do is try not to pass directly over the cap of the pump of the CPU cooler or the water block.
You don't want to pass over this.
Eh, just best practices. This has a very low profile cap on it, but if you have something that's really tall, there is a limited amount of like Z height here, or I guess
I see.
X to work with.
Yeah.
So just want to keep stuff flat against the board. You can kind of like press that to flatten it out, and then pop your memory.
Oh, and there's another cable management here too, so I can
Yeah, if you
probably
need to,
zip tie
depending
it back.
on where stuff ends up, you may or may not need to use all the little
Okay.
cable type points. But we put as many of them as we could all over kind of these 2 sides of the board, so that you kind of pull stuff
Okay.
away from it. But yeah, so
So RAM,
yeah, I would put the RAM in.
I'm just gonna,
Yeah, just squish that cable out of the way.
and there's that click that we're looking for. This should also lock back into place, these guards. Yeah, it's a tight fit, but it's there. And number 2, right into second slot. Always listen for the click
Yeah, you
and
go.
locking.
All right, cool. So now that the memory's there, you kind of have an idea of all of the obstacles on the board that you're gonna have to deal with, and you can start kind of getting the front panel headers to where you want them to go.
Okay.
What I usually would do is try to get all of the excess length to go under the case.
Yeah, there's a
Right.
lot of nice room in here.
Yeah,
which
so
is good.
like you can kind of see this naturally kind of wants to go that way, and then kind of bundle it up there, and then
Okay.
just kind of push the excess
remainder
length.
out. I also highly recommend Velcro rather than zip ties because they're easier to remove and replace if you want to manage and you're managing in ITX for the first time. It might behoove you to have something that you can easily get rid of instead of or manipulate instead of like buying a whole other canister of zip ties if you've zip tied your whole thing and found out that you wanted to do something different.
Next thing we will do is get ready to mount the cooler.
That's why I like the magnetic screwdrivers because they can hold the screw while I place things. So,
Alright.
fans?
So one thing to consider, that probably one of the only actual decisions you'll make when configuring this case is if you want the fans to be intake or exhaust.
Okay.
Right, so if you have them as exhaust, they're gonna exhaust air outside of the case. If they're intake, they're gonna pull air into the case. Really what you're doing is figuring out whether you want to prioritize CPU or graphics card temperatures.
Okay.
Because if you have them as an intake, you're pulling in fresh air directly from the outside for the CPU, which is being cooled by this radiator. That will lower your CPU temperatures and kind of not really affect the graphics card temperatures too much. But if you flip them the other way, it will create a little bit of negative pressure inside the case. It'll pull more air from where the graphics card is up front. So you'll warm up your CPU a little bit and cool the graphics card. Because most people are building these as gaming PCs, the graphics card is going to be the most like the highest priority for cooling, just because if it's able to boost, you get more for FPS in your games. And the CPU, a lot of times, there's so much thermal headroom that you get from a 240mm radiator when you're just playing a game that's how we recommend people do it. But if you're using it as like a render machine or something and you're actually doing a lot of CPU work, then maybe flip it the other way around and have the CPU or the fans pull in air from the outside.
Okay, so like for professional users, use it primarily as intake. For gaming PCs, primarily best practice is out.
Yes.
Pushing
Yeah.
out. Okay. Cool.
And it doesn't matter as far as dust filtering, because there's dust filters on every surface, whether they're being used as intake or exhaust.
So I've got them both kind of angled this way.
Yeah, that'll work. Like I said, the main thing is you want the cables to exit along the spine, because otherwise you gotta figure out how to wrap them back around the fans. When you're gonna open the door of the case, it's better if all the cables are along that pivot, because they don't have to stretch then.
Cool.
The next bit is going to be probably the bulk of the more tedious part of the cable management.
So, after a little bit of editing magic, here is our final cable management for this. Now, I want to keep in mind something really specific. This cooler is an RGB cooler, which means it's going to have a lot more cables than a cooler without RGB. If you're replacing this with a cooler that you already have that has RGB, just know that there's extra cables to manage. You don't necessarily need this in here, especially because all the panels kind of come on and obscure a lot of the lighting. This is kind of meant to be a really clean, modern aesthetic. From here, let's talk about a couple of other storage options. So we did the M.2 on the motherboard, but what if you had a traditional hard drive or like an SSD?
The case supports whatever M.2 the motherboard can fit, one mechanical hard drive and two 2.5-inch SSDs. The mechanical hard drive actually fits into this little cage here next to the power supply. If you turn the case, you can kind of see where it goes in.
See right here.
So the drive will install screws out towards the radiator with the ports facing back, and it just slots into that space there.
Oh, fantastic.
So if you see how it kind of squishes up against stuff, sometimes the power supply cables can kind of move into the space that that drive wants to be in.
Oh, I see. Which is why this panel's removable.
Yeah,
so you can
which is why we made
it
able to take that panel off. It's probably easier if we lay the case down. Actually, no.
I think I'm able to get it.
Okay, yeah, you just kind of squish them out of the way. Yeah.
Let me just shift this just a little more.
Yep. So we have another SATA power. This one has two, and that's for the two spots for the drives.
One here and one here.
Yep. And you can pick whichever one you want to install. Basically, the drive gets these little rubber
Standoffs?
little kind of standoff things, and they just kind of slot in.
So we've got this.
Yep. So that'll just notch in either facing the connector down if it's the other way.
This way?
Yep.
Okay. And then it just slots in. There it is. And then slides down.
Yep.
Boom.
And then you've got your power connector, and then the last thing will be to run the data cable.
Now this is usually the hardest thing in ITX builds, just like figuring out how to orient a giant graphics card in your tiny case.
Yep.
But a couple things that I want to point out, just because I want to brag on it, I think it's cool. This is a vertical oriented GPU setup, but this case is designed to not use a riser cable between the graphics card and motherboard. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So that was something that the Revolt 1 had, right? So in order to stay super, super thin, it actually used a PCB riser card, but that created another point of failure in the system.
Yeah.
So that's one reason. Another one is they cost money. It adds to the cost of the system, especially if you want a PCIe Gen 4 riser cable. At least at this time, they're really expensive. You're talking about, you could double your RAM or storage space for the cost of that cable. So we basically go all the way up to triple slot graphics cards. So that's like just a hair under 60 millimeters thick. We can go up to about 332, 335, depending on how the card is pointed at the end, tall up into the roof of the case. And I don't have I'll check the instruction manual. I don't have the the width directly memorized. 140 millimeters wide. So that's
always good to read the directions.
This is a pretty modestly sized card by modern standards. It's still a big card. If you actually put this next to like an older RTX, 2080. Or something like that. It's about the same size as that card. It's just now the 30 series cards and the new 6000 series cards, they're huge. We actually have a list of cards that we tested ourselves in the system up on HYTE.com, so they can check. Like, there's a few cards that won't fit, but there's a whole bunch of ones that will, even some that you don't expect might fit.
And all of those graphics cards that are on the site, we definitely tested them in the system to make sure that they would fit. That list will expand over time as we continue to test other graphics cards too. So be sure to keep an eye on the website for that. All right, let's get this in here. So it's just off to the side here, and then I'm gonna come around and slot this into place. I'm just gonna push back on that a little bit just to get it in. And there it is. Where's my click? Click, click. There's the click. Yep, it's fastened. Okay. We're good.
So you can go ahead and grab that plate. There's 2 different positions that plate can go in. One can be here for lower connectors like this. Other cards have their connectors up at the top, so there's another position for it up there.
So for the audience at home, this position right here, which is what we're gonna use, or if you have a taller graphics card, it'll go right here. Yeah. So there is a little bit more precision involved, but overall, honestly, I think building my first PC at all was far more intimidating than this is. And here is the big reveal of my beautiful, clean, sleek, just built Revolt 3 system. I am super proud of this, and I can't believe it was even as easy as it was to build for the first time. So thank you, Brad.
Yep, see, I told you all you had to do was follow the instructions.
The only thing left to do is accessorize. There we are. Actually, now that I've got mine and you've got yours, do you want to just go play some games now?
Yeah, let's go.
Cool. Have a good one, guys.